Death Stranding is one of the most disappointing video games I have ever played.
You've never played a game like Death Stranding before. You've never experienced this gameplay loop. You've never seen asynchronous social systems this developed.
But because it's so different and so out there, I find it hard to recommend to a lot of people.
It's a game that requires patience, compassion, and love, and it's also one we really need right now.
But it's all been saddled on a backbone made of repetitive mission design and arduous traversal.
I do like this game. I mostly love it, in fact.
I can't stress enough how miserable the gameplay is. You've never played an open world game that let you reshape the landscape like this.
The obstacles you face in Death Stranding are ones of mild inconvenience.
At its core, it never stops being about the sheer power and purpose we can find in human connection.
It simply can't support its weight over the full course of the journey.
And it's confident in stylistic storytelling.
I can only hope that this is the last Strand type game, because it is a complete and utter embarrassment.
Many different things have been said about Death Stranding in the 6 years it's been released. In this video, I want to take a top to bottom look at Death Stranding and see if time has aged it gently or not. We're going to cover a lot of ground here, from gameplay, narrative, storytelling, and what it all means, at least from my perspective. But before we get started on any of that, let's talk about my lens for analysis and what I'm looking for in this process. The goal and theme of Death Stranding is connection. That's straight from Kojima himself. So going through this game, that's going to be my goal, is to see how all of these elements of Death Stranding enforce the aforementioned goal. So when I'm looking at the gameplay and the story, sure, I'm looking at it to see how well it functions, but I'm also looking at it to see how well it points to the overarching purpose and message of the art piece. Because that's the ultimate end Kojima is trying to reach here. I feel like it's important that you know my perspective as a critic so that you can understand where I'm coming from, and ultimately weigh it against where you're coming from as a viewer, and make up your own decisions about the dialogue that I'm hoping to start in this video. Also, spoiler warning for all of these games on screen. I'll try to keep things vague whenever I deal with heavy spoiler stuff, but especially when I get to the story segments, sometimes I have to be direct. So I'll make sure that there are on-screen spoiler warnings when they happen as well. But this is your first warning. With that being said, let's take a jump into our first area of inspection, which has to be the world, so we can properly set the stage for the rest of the discussion. Death Stranding takes place in a post-apocalyptic America, after an event called the Death Stranding wipes out most of the American population. You play as Sam Porter Bridges, who starts out as a freelance porter, which is essentially a UPS guy for the unfamiliar, trekking across and delivering packages for the fragmented cities in America. A wild series of events that we'll cover later leads to Sam joining up with Bridges, a government organization focused on rebuilding America and establishing the United Cities of America by connecting the scattered cities to the chiral network, which I'm going to temporarily describe as the internet on steroids. Sam's mission won't be as easy as simply walking across the country and getting these cities connected, because the Death Stranding wasn't just a catastrophic event that rocked the world. It was a fundamental change in the rulebook on how life functions. Ghost-like creatures called BTs appeared all over the world. Rain has been turned into the Timefall, a rainstorm where each drop of water rapidly ages whatever it touches, and the appearance of a new element called chiralium, on which the chiral network functions, all sprang into existence at the same time as the Death Stranding. All of these things play a role in your journey to connect America. I think that's a sufficient synopsis for the time being, so let's break that down. The most important thing a world needs to do right off the bat is establish truths and ask questions. The balance between these two factors is crucial to maintaining an accessible world. Too little truths, and a lot of players will put the game down because they have too many questions and don't even know where to start. And conversely, if you have too few questions, some players will drop it because there's seemingly nothing to engage with from a mental standpoint. Death Stranding, at least in the beginning, gets a pretty good balance of both. It should be noted that my preference skews towards the side of having more questions, so I could understand if my consensus here is not the common one. There's enough meat to where I understand the state of the world and what my goal is. My purpose is clear: reconnect America. But there are questions that surround that purpose, that motivate me to continue. What caused the Death Stranding? What's up with Sam's family, and who is Anomaly to him? What in the world are BTs and BBs, really? All of these questions give you intrinsic motivation to continue playing the game. Flipping to the other side of the coin, though, how is the world in a virtual physical sense? Does the design and appearance make the player want to play in it as a sandbox? This one's a little more iffy. As someone who has played the game for over 80 hours, I can confidently say, yeah, it does. But I think you have to develop a taste for it over time. I've heard people say that the world of Death Stranding is visually redundant, and while I don't agree, I wouldn't blame someone for expressing that sentiment, especially based off of the starting area. In Death Stranding, the primary inspiration is Icelandic landscapes, which I think it does a great job of capturing. But when viewed in the larger context of open worlds in the gaming industry, it's easy to understand where the criticism comes from. In the open world genre, scale is emphasized greatly, and there's usually some standout set piece to entice you into exploring further, like Death Mountain or Hyrule Castle in Breath of the Wild, or the Erdtree in Elden Ring. But Death Stranding doesn't really have a key set piece in the world, at least not immediately. You see, the opening area of Death Stranding doesn't actually do itself any favors because it's disconnected to the larger 70% of the map. And you'll be spending around 10 hours in this first area of Death Stranding, which is largely the same biome, with some variation within itself. I already mentioned Breath of the Wild, so let's look back at it for a moment. The starting area of the game, the Great Plateau, is often called the best tutorial in gaming, but the reason I'm bringing it up here is that it is literally designed to give you an excellent perspective of a larger world, and just how much there is to go and explore once you leave it. The variety in visual and environmental design is on clear display to the player, even if you can't access it yet. Now, look back at Death Stranding and think about how much of a deficit it is being an ocean away from a larger, more interesting portion of the map. There is variety in design to be found in Death Stranding, but you wouldn't know it based on the first 10 hours of the game, which is a long time, by the way. Once you make it out of there, then you're pretty quickly treated to the vista of a massive mountain looming over you, just waiting to be climbed. And from this point onwards, that's when Death Stranding's world really shines. It still struggles on the topic of having key landmarks that add additional character or significance to the locales, which I think we need more of across the board. We've got some, like the weather station or the snowy mountain that holds Mountain Knot City, or this waterfall over by here, and even small stuff like the lake outside Hartman's lab. These things help add additional character within these biomes, and I would have liked to have seen more of them across the board. But even with that being said, the world of Death Stranding is conservative artistically, but that doesn't mean it's not engaging to play in, because even though that mountain over there may not have a name, the concept of a mountain carries a lot more weight in Death Stranding than in a typical open world title. That's because for most of Death Stranding, you are engaging directly, hands and feet, with the world. I'll save most of this conversation for the gameplay section in just a minute, but the tools of which you interact with the world shape your perspective of it. In Death Stranding, it's really the lack thereof that makes the world significant. For a large portion of the game, you are going to be walking and climbing with a very simple tool set of ropes and ladders to traverse the environment. This means that the conservative world design is actually quite imposing, and that interaction adds the extra layer of character that I was looking for in the world. But to continue this conversation, we need to talk about I've been beating around the bush here, so let's fully talk about the gameplay of Death Stranding. Hideo Kojima notoriously went on record to claim that Death Stranding was the first Strand-type game. So what does that actually look like, and was Kojima onto something? Let's dig into that. The core gameplay loop of Death Stranding is delivering packages for the citizens of America. But what that actually translates into for gameplay can mean a number of different things. But it's primarily walking. And this is where Death Stranding lost a lot of people. They complained about how the game is just a walking sim and that it's so boring. And listen, you're allowed to not like the gameplay, but calling it a walking sim is a very reductive generalization, because there's actually quite a few different systems and elements that provide variety in gameplay. So let's break these down within the context of early to mid game in mind. Starting with the most important one, traversal and delivering. While it's not the only thing you do, hiking across the shattered America with just your hands and feet will make up a majority of your time spent in Death Stranding. But the thing is, you aren't some superhuman delivery guy. You're just a physically normal human porter with some tools at his disposal. For most games, it's the tools or abilities you use to engage with the game that create its own unique experience. But Death Stranding is more defined by its lack of crazy tools or abilities. Because when your resources are limited, that means you actually have to strategize. As we've talked about earlier, Death Stranding's world is no walk in the park to navigate. There will be tons of obstacles in your way, so you can't just put a waypoint down and figure it out. You'll need to examine your route and figure out which path gets you there quickly and safely. Do I want to go straight through that mountain or walk around it? What's the best place I can cross this river? And what kind of tools do I need on this delivery? And it's when Death Stranding pushes you that the game really shines. But therein lies an issue. It's only when the game pushes you to get your crap together that it becomes a notable gameplay experience. But on a normal playthrough, that doesn't really happen that much. If you choose to just take on one order at a time and you don't pack on those packages, traversal does become trivial. And because it's easy, you don't have to strategize. You can mostly just figure it out as you go, and that's a boring way to play the game. It's probably where most of the walking sim complaints come from. The most important thing to keep a player invested in a game is to keep them making decisions. With no packages on your back, you don't have to make many decisions. But you can bet your butt that when you've got 30 packages stacked, you're going to be scratching your head trying to figure out how exactly you're going to handle this one. But that raises the question. If someone isn't getting the most out of this game, is that on them? Or is it on the game for not maximizing its own potential? Wait, what do Death Stranding speedruns look like? Let's hop over to a different subcategory here. Let's talk about combat and stealth. Hey, guess what? Death Stranding has combat. Shocker, right? Turns out the walking sim has a little more to do than just walking. But the combat and stealth in this game has a big problem. That problem is that the most recent game Kojima made before this was Metal Gear Solid V, which is pretty much the golden standard for the stealth action experience. Seriously, the gameplay of MGSV is actually amazing, and Death Stranding doesn't come anywhere close to that, and it's not supposed to. Combat and stealth are not the core elements of the gameplay loop here, like they are in MGSV, but the comparisons are inescapable because Kojima is heavily tied to both titles. The odds were always going to be stacked against this game, but I'm going to do my best to take prior Kojima games out of the equation here as much as I can. Though, I will use them as examples for illustration. I think the biggest service Combat does for this game is simply providing a different type of objective to go out and do. Ultimately, this is side content, not the main course, so diversifying the gameplay dish is a valid purpose to serve. All across America, you'll find camps of rogue porters and terrorists who cause problems for every sane person still left on the continent. You'll have to raid their bases and steal back the stuff they stole from your clients, and that's why we even have combat in this game. In terms of actual battle mechanics, the combat systems aren't really in-depth or that thought-provoking. It opts for the approach of giving the player lots of options to pick from that are relatively one-dimensional, rather than fully fleshing out any particular mechanic or weapon. You'll have plenty of stuff to use at your disposal, like an assault rifle, bola gun, grenades, or just your hands and feet, but all those tools are pretty much surface level. Like I said, this approach works because traversal is the primary gameplay loop in Death Stranding, not beating up other UPS drivers. That being said, the CQC in this game ain't half bad. At first it seems like all you can do is just 3-punch combo people, but if you mess around, you'll realize you have a few melee options to take advantage of. For one, you'll have your Strand, a rope you can use to parry attacks and bind up enemies. But then if you jump, you'll notice you have a knee slam and even a drop kick. I actually think the drop kick is very funny. Imagine you saw your mailman drop kick a porch pirate. Wouldn't that be amazing? Right. A mechanic that seems to fly under the radar is punching people with packages, and also throwing those packages at people. I like this a lot actually, because it's on brand, and it also gets you using your environment to fight. Whenever you knock someone out, 90% of the time they were carrying an item. You can pick up that item and use it as a weapon. Seriously man, this could kill someone. Oh, hey, killing people, that's another mechanic. Kojima games almost always have non-fatal ways of taking people down in combat, but in Death Stranding, it's pretty much mandatory. You see, in this game, if you kill someone and don't dispose of their body, they go into necrosis, and if necrosis persists for 48 hours, they will go necro and turn into a BT, which is not preferable. So if you kill someone, you have to manually take their body to an incinerator or a tar pit to dispose of it. This is an interesting mechanic for sure, but it almost seems like Kojima Productions was scared of this being too much of a pain to deal with, because there are so many non-lethal options in this game that I don't think I ever killed someone in my 70 hours of the game. Strike that, I intentionally did it once to see what happened. Don't try this at home, kids. And that's the thing. Due to having so many options to take people out non-lethally, the whole necrosis deal kind of gets nullified. And it's not like non-lethal takes extra work either. Maybe it does in early game, but very soon you'll have non-lethal assault rifles and stun grenades to prevent any deaths from happening with no extra sweat from your brow. Going back to Metal Gear Solid, what made non-lethal interesting in those games is that it was harder. You had to have a more comprehensive strategy because you weren't killing people. That's missing here. There's really no reason to not kill people. Not to mention that people stay unconscious for a while, so it's not like you have to worry about them getting back up, which was something you would have had to consider in the past if you were getting your sneak on. Which brings us to stealth. Disappointingly, I feel like stealth leaves a little to be desired overall. The main issue is that, like we've already discussed, the primary gameplay focus of Death Stranding is delivering packages, and the map is designed with that in mind, not for stealth. There are elements added to assist in stealth, like tall grass and more frequent rock fragments in the areas you'd be sneaking around, but in the end it can't completely fix the problem that fundamentally the world design itself does not really yield to engaging stealth gameplay. Another thing that brings it down is that there really isn't encounter variety for sneaking around, with one exception in the director's cut of the game. For the most part, it feels like your stealth strategy is going to be the same for each area you try to get into. Hide behind some rocks, maybe shoot that guy with the bullet gun, hide behind some more rocks, break into their storage, grab some stuff, and get out, provided you don't get caught halfway into it. By the way, you're probably going to get caught quite a bit until you have the ability to negate scanner pings. Honestly, I don't even remember when that happens in the game, but even with that, sometimes you'll just get spotted by some random dude you didn't even know was there. The enemy sightlines in this game feel odd. I couldn't tell you if they're good or bad if I'm straight up with you. While we're on that topic, the AI in this game is not that good. Aside from them being just not all that competent, it doesn't really feel like they have any set strategy or formation. There's just kind of dudes walking around in an insignificant pattern. There's no watchtowers or anything for the AI to use. The dudes patrolling the base are really as complex as it gets, alongside the scanners that ping you. I guess there are these enemy trucks that sometimes patrol, but ultimately you still avoid them the same way you would a single guy patrolling. You just probably want to give them a wider berth. None of these are deal-breaking flaws. It just ended up making me want something with more sustenance. It's really hard to shake the larger context of a Kojima game having stealth that's just okay, and that makes its mediocrity hurt a little more, I think. There's one more thing to talk about that relates to stealth and combat, but these guys are a little different, so they get their own segment here. Okay, we've mentioned so far that BTs exist in Death Stranding, and we're still not going to get into the nitty-gritty on what they are exactly, but for now, know that they're ghosts who want to give you a big hug. That hug also kills you, by the way. The narrative significance of BTs is very high, but what is the gameplay significance? BTs appear in areas of increased chiral density. Most of the time it's in Timefall, but it can also be around set areas like incinerators. When a BT horde appears, they'll be drifting, waiting for any unsuspecting porter to pass through near them so they can drag them away to the boss BT. And that boss is the one who munches up the person. So when you encounter BT territory, you have to keep quiet, because BTs don't actually see, they hear. Oh, and they're also invisible. Luckily, Sam has Dooms and a BB, both of which help sense and sometimes see BTs. That's the most interesting part of BTs, is not knowing where they are and not knowing how many there are. Getting through a BT-infested area can be tricky because by dodging one, you could be going right toward another, so you end up weaving a path and zigzagging your whole way through the area to the other side. If you do make too much noise, the BTs will hear you and start hunting you. And if you don't quiet down after that, they'll fast track for you and start mobbing you like Michael Jackson in the 80s. Once you get familiar with how to shake them off, you can get pretty good at disengaging and escaping at this part. But if you don't, that's where they drag you away, to the boss BT. This is where the boss battles start to crop up. The environment gets drastically changed as tar fills the area and the old structures rise out of the swamp. Now I'm going to be $100 with you. In terms of gameplay, with the exception of the last 2 to 3 story bosses, I don't have any feelings on the bosses in Death Stranding. They just kind of exist, I guess. They weren't particularly challenging, and I wouldn't say they were boring either. Overall, just not really anything to write home about. But, from a spectacle sense, they were pretty impressive. The BTs are huge and imposing, with unique designs for the most part. The historical boss fights, quote-unquote, were really cool and completely out of left field for me because I didn't get to see any of the marketing for this game before play. That helps the boss fights generally come out as a positive experience in my book. But circling off of bosses and back to BTs, they suffer from one big problem in this game: trivialization. You see, in the early game, BTs are a big source of opposition, and they were also actually scary. Whenever they showed up, it was probably gonna go down. But as you get better at the game and learn to navigate through BTs better, and once you unlock a certain ability that pretty much lets you do stealth takedowns on BTs, they stop becoming a scary threat and slowly just turn into nuisances. The tension pretty much is gone in the late game, and whenever a BT appears, it feels more like an exasperated sigh than anything else. Their significance in the gameplay loop fades out more and more over time. And throughout the game, as you acquire all these tools to help handle BTs, they never really level up in return. A BT in the early game is the same as one in the end for the most part. And, you know, it wouldn't really be a big deal in most games if you end up outclassing an enemy type. But in Death Stranding, the BTs have notable narrative significance. So there's this imbalance of how much impact BTs have on gameplay and how much they affect the story. That dissonance makes the trivialization of BTs feel more disappointing than it would in most games. And this criticism of BTs is similar to my main problem with the whole gameplay loop, so let's finally cover that. Do you remember earlier when I praised Death Stranding for scaling back player power levels and forcing you to really interact with the environment? And how that lowered power level meant you really had to strategize and plan out your routes before you embarked on delivery? Well, I have bad news. That gameplay ideology kind of falls apart somewhere around the midpoint of the game. Death Stranding suffers from the same issue that the last Kojima game suffers from: power creep. Now, as a term, power creep is traditionally used in reference to newer equipment in a game completely outclassing or invalidating older equipment. An example would be Fatalis' armor in Monster Hunter World. But for this use case, I'm not talking about power creep invalidating other pieces of equipment. I'm talking about the power creep invalidating the world, and in turn, the gameplay loop itself. The primary offenders of this are the vehicles and the zipline. Let's start with the vehicles. I'm not inherently against vehicles. In fact, I like them in this game. I think they're pretty cool. And initially, they start out fine. The trike is a great vehicle for transportation that balances itself because of its small size and lack of carrying space. There's a trade-off: space for speed. And it doesn't have a big battery. You'll still have to plan if you want to stay on the bike for the duration of your trip, because you'll probably need to stop at some generators, and then you get some variations of the trike and they're all still mostly fine. But then Biggest Truckus comes along and kind of throws things out of whack. The truck has a lot of carrying space, even in its default version, so the trade-off of speed for space is not as present here. Now you might say that the truck does have a large drawback. It's big and bulky and can't get around as well. To which I say, yeah, there's some merit to that, but only really when you're inexperienced with the truck. As you continue to drive it, you'll realize that you can get just about anywhere that isn't the mountain in this thing. It's kind of funny, actually. At first, you'll want to try and be all careful with how you drive, and then eventually you realize that just full sending it is usually the best bet. But at least you still have the limitations of the battery to deal with, right? Well, not for long, because the truck also has some modified variants, like the long-range truck. Huge battery on this guy. I'm playing American Truck Sim now in this thing. The limitations of the vehicles in Death Stranding is supposed to be the terrain. The whole strategizing and planning element of the gameplay loop could still be intact if the vehicles were tuned down just a little more. But with how adaptable these things are, most environmental issues can just be brute forced in time. So in the end, these environments that I'm supposed to have this relationship with, this struggle with, gets rolled over by my 2049 Ford F-150 with a Keep on Trucking sticker on it. As the game progresses, vehicles ultimately turn the core of Death Stranding's gameplay into busy work. Now, it's important to know that the influence of vehicles in this game is context sensitive. If you're using a vehicle on a delivery to an area that isn't connected to the chiral network, that is a little more balanced, because in this case, there won't be any generators to top off your tank whenever you need. BTs also do manage an effective roadblock against vehicles, but in a lot of situations, you can just drive around the BTs without too much issue. Or, if you want, you can just drive straight through them, and with a little bit of luck, you'll outrun them. So while certain contexts help mitigate the vehicular imbalance, sometimes it also makes it worse. Enter highways. I like highways, especially the process of building them and expanding. But the reality is that when paired with vehicles, you basically don't have to pay attention to anything around you. I mean, the area around the distribution center south of Lake Knot City pretty much turns into hold forward the area, because the highway network will get you to a lot of the places you need to go. And if they don't get you all the way, they'll probably get you pretty close. Now, it's worth noting that highways don't expand or build themselves. So you could easily say, if you don't like them, just don't use them. Which is fair, but that's only something you can say with the benefit of hindsight. I didn't fully know the impact highways would have until I built them and sufficiently used them. There's also another note I have on the design philosophy of highways, but we'll get to that when I talk about the zipline in just a second. Getting back to vehicles now, and with the different context of the end game, your chiral network is probably going to be nearly filled out. That means that a lot of the areas you'll drive through will have open accessibility to generators. So in my post-game experience, I haven't really had to worry much at all about running out of energy, because everywhere I go, there's a generator, or I could just make one myself. Now at this point you might be saying, if you don't like vehicles, just don't use them. And to that I say, yeah, eventually I did stop, and I enjoyed the game more. But that whole issue gets back into that topic that we're putting a pin in for just a second. First, we gotta talk about ziplines. Ziplines are introduced whenever you get to the Mountain Knot City region, and they're pretty awesome. Or that's what I thought after my first few uses of them. But as you continue to connect areas of the chiral network and upgrade the zipline, this thing is kind of ridiculous. I think it was designed with the purpose of helping you get across the Mountain Knot region, but it's really too good at its job. If you put some thought into it, walking in the mountains becomes a thing of the past. Ziplines are the highways of hard-to-traverse regions. There's all this landscape for you to navigate and work through, but in time, you'll end up just flying over it and never setting your feet down in that valley again. The Mountain Knot region is one of the most difficult and hazardous areas in the game, and serves as a good test of skill for the player. But it's a test that I ended up skipping a lot, because the zipline made it so easy. And now, instead of that region being intimidating, it's actually kind of boring, because the mountains yield so well to ziplines. Look at all this level design I get to ignore thanks to the zipline. Now flipping that coin to the other side, I don't think ziplines are as much of a problem as vehicles, even if the act of using them is more boring and they invalidate level design more than a truck does. Because these zipline networks I mentioned are not there by default, just like highways. You have to build them. There will be some ziplines around to start with, but they don't become busted until you start pulling together a network, just like highways. And honestly, building the zipline network itself is enjoyable, and that first ride on that crazy route you just made is always fun. These reasons are why I still like ziplines, but they create problems in the long run. As always, you could just say, if you don't like them, then don't use them. And there's merit to that. And if you can just not use them and be happy, then that's great. But all of these elements start to provoke some questions about game design on a larger scale. Death Stranding's endgame left me with this question. Why is my reward for engaging with the game's mechanics and systems being able to ignore those said mechanics and systems? And that is my main tagline for the issue I have with the progression in this game. Ultimately, by the end of the game, vehicles, ziplines, highways, they aren't expanding on game mechanics as much as they are nullifying them. And it really ends up feeling like Kojima Productions was almost not confident that players would fully buy into the grounded traversal, and added all these other mechanics just as an out to soothe the gamer rage. I'm not saying that's reality, but that's just what it feels like to me whenever I'm thinking all these things. There is another crime that these things commit, and that is that it takes the focus off my favorite thing the game does in its gameplay, which I actually haven't talked about yet, so I think I'll do that now. If you've played Death Stranding before, then you are probably wondering about this mechanic's absence of mentioning directly up until now. I was saving it for this. We all know the infamous Kojima quote about how Death Stranding would be the first Strand-type game. Most people think that he was referring to the delivering packages element of the game that makes it Strand-type. That's not the case. In context, he says that Death Stranding is the first Strand-type game because of the social strand network. And while the concept for the SSN isn't entirely new, it's more fleshed out in Death Stranding than in any other game I've played prior. The SSN is a system that allows for structures, signs, cargo, and data of other players to appear in your world, and vice versa. I've previously alluded to structures like generators and ziplines as if they were pre-existing in the world, but that is not actually the case. With a few exceptions, every structure you see in Death Stranding was placed by a real person, whether it was you or someone else. The established theme of Death Stranding is connection, and this is how Kojima has chosen to illustrate that theme through gameplay. And it's that philosophy of connection that is the standout design choice in my experience with Death Stranding. We'll touch on the themes of this in storytelling, so I'll stick with the tangible elements for now. Not only is it helpful to have player structures appear in other worlds, but it creates another avenue for gameplay. Now when you play, you aren't just trying to complete deliveries, you can also have a lens of being a team player, being on the lookout for spots where you could place a helpful structure like a climbing anchor on the top of a cliff, or a jump ramp in front of a river. This creates a new form of engagement for the player, and it's motivated by just being nice. That's really cool to me. I love it when a game is bold enough to make a player part of an experiment. Video games are actually an excellent medium for social experiments and tests. I want to see more things like this. This system inherently encourages players to go out of their way to help each other, even though there isn't much incentive to do so. Let's look at the likes, for example. When you place a structure or a sign, players can leave likes on it. There is no incentive to farm likes, and there is no incentive to leave them. It's essentially just saying thanks. But yet, structures still get hundreds of thousands of likes from other players. Placing a structure that benefits a bunch of other players is satisfying, even though it provides no extrinsic value to you. And that's kind of what I love about it. In an industry where everything is incentivized with rewards, and systems literally engineered to hack your brain's dopamine, Death Stranding stands against it, where the most fulfilling part of its gameplay is an intrinsically motivated thing you do, just to help others. And there's so many other parts of the system that encourage the togetherness of Death Stranding. Whether it's how there were little holograms that show there were signs of another player there. This one means someone peed here. Or how paths start to form on the routes that collect the most traffic by players. And there's things like share lockers that just let you give stuff away that you don't need anymore. Or you could go pick up someone's lost cargo and help them complete their delivery. It's just so cool. Before I get to my peak of Death Stranding, I feel like I would be amiss not to mention the photo mode. Taking pictures in Death Stranding was low-key one of my favorite parts of the game. It helps that there was a photo campaign happening while I played the game, but even so, I feel like photo mode really complements Death Stranding as a game. It encourages you to stop and smell the roses and really take the game in, and helps you to see the game in a different light. Highly recommend to anyone playing through it. See what kind of pictures you can snag in your playthrough. Death Stranding is a game played best when you stop for a moment to appreciate things. Whether that's someone else's structure or a view of a landscape, as long as you're smelling the roses, you're good. But let me talk about my highlight experience with this game. The place where I really felt the connection this game has been trying to push. Near the end of Death Stranding, when you're finally close to reaching the Edge-Knot City, you'll arrive at a beach. The beach, or rather the ocean of tar that makes it, separates you from Edge-Knot City. And when you arrive, you don't know how to cross it. That's where I'm at in my playthrough of Death Stranding when this moment happened. I'm standing on the beach, running around and exploring to see what it is that I was missing, because honestly, I didn't have a clue how to get across. As I was wandering, I was listening to the song Once in a Long, Long While by Low Roar. I continued looking around and I didn't really know where this thought came from, but it just occurred to me, maybe I have to jump in. And then all of a sudden, I looked around and all of the structures that had seemed random made sense. The signs that people left on the shore, the jump ramps that pointed straight towards the ocean, the chiral bridges that led over Vatar, they all pointed towards the sea. As I had that realization, it felt suddenly like I was being lifted or guided by all the other players who had came before me. It sticks out so much to me now, how vivid that felt. This wasn't the end of the game, or a particularly important moment of the game, but to me, this was the culmination of my experience with Death Stranding. It really did feel like all the other porters were standing beside me in that moment. And for that minute, I just walked around and took it in. And in a way, this is also a moment that demonstrates why video games work as a medium for story. The personal and social aspects that play into everything at work here are only really present in video games. But I won't get into that side tangent right now. So as Once in a Long Long While came to a close, I walked into the bridge, made by someone else, and took a leap into the unknown. And then I almost broke my ankles. Unfortunately, life isn't a movie, and I wasn't actually correct in thinking that a leap of faith into the ocean would take me across the Sea of Tar. While I wasn't too far off in my guess, it still kind of snapped me back to reality real quick. And in hindsight, though I might have been wrong about what the game wanted me to do, I was right about what the game was trying to say, what it was trying to make me feel. And even for all of this game's flaws, which I've probably harped on for more than they're worth, that moment resonated with me more than anything else I played that year. If you want to see what else I played in 2024, go look at my Best of 2024 video. Death Stranding is special, and that moment will still be what I think of when I look back on this game. But I can't look back right now because I need to look forward and get on to the next part of the video. What's up next anyways? Let's take a quick break from all of the analytical stuff and just talk about the presentation of this game. Death Stranding is a beautiful and very graphically impressive game, especially when considering that it's 6 years old, and it also runs great, which can't be said for a lot of games releasing these days. As already discussed, Death Stranding opts for a realistic art style in a post-apocalyptic environment. For as many things that have gone wrong in the world of Death Stranding, it has a strangely peaceful atmosphere. The environments and landscapes of Death Stranding take influence from many places, but the key inspirer is definitely Iceland. Aside from being beautiful, I did some digging to find out why specifically Iceland. Was there any motivation for the world being designed after it, other than it fit the vibe? I had a hard time coming up with any substantial results, but I did get a few nuggets. Firstly, Iceland is an island that is fairly isolated, with a population of only 393,000 people. Hideo Kojima went location scouting there before the release of Metal Gear Solid V, and he had a couple of tweets about it. Though it's interesting, his trip there was in 2014, before Death Stranding had even entered into production, or before Kojima Productions had even formed. Like I said, he was still working with Konami at this time. Makes me wonder if we were going to get a Death Stranding under Konami originally. And how long had Kojima been conceptualizing this game if he went location scouting this early on? It's also possible that he wasn't originally going scouting specifically for Death Stranding, but Iceland resonated with him, and so when he set out to make Death Stranding, he might have always had Iceland as a topographical inspiration from its conception. Anyway, some more connecting points is that Kojima discovered the Icelandic band Low Roar in a disc shop while visiting Iceland. Low Roar features heavily in the game, so that's another strand to connect with why Iceland was picked. Iceland is also a geologically active area with lots of volcanic activity and shifting in the landmass. Fun fact, Iceland is being pulled apart 1 whole centimeter per year. Iceland is a geologically tumultuous place, so I think that's also something that yields to why Kojima might have picked it. But ultimately, I don't have anything for certain. If someone knows an interview or anything where he talks about it, let me know in the comments. I'd love to figure out why, but until then, I'm just going to assume that Iceland was a place that resonated with Kojima, and that when he thought of walking through a solitary world, his memories of Iceland are what emerged. I also couldn't talk about presentation and not talk about the OST. Ludwig Forsell is showing his mastery in craft once again, and he does some excellent work in Death Stranding, along with Joel Korolitz, who doesn't disappoint either. The soundscape of Death Stranding's OST is distinct and excellently accompanies the game itself. I do wish they were a little more proud of presenting the soundtrack in-game though. all the special moments are usually reserved for licensed music, which I loved, but I wish the spotlight was shared a little bit. I guess I should probably talk about the UI and such here, but honestly, that's not my forte, and I don't really have any passion to talk about that. But it was good, I'll say that. Before we move on to the heaping task of taking on the story of Death Stranding, let's have a little interlude to appreciate the sights and sounds of Death Stranding. The rope, along with the stick, are two of mankind's oldest tools. The stick to keep away the bad, the rope to bring the good towards us. They were our first friends of our own invention. Wherever there were people, there were the rope and the stick. That's the quote upon which Death Stranding opens, and that rope and stick is a philosophy core to both Death Strandings. Death Stranding 1 is primarily about the rope. Now, what I'm wanting to do here is not to give you a comprehensive overview of the story, then break that story down for why it works and why it doesn't work. But mainly, I really want to look at the themes of this game and how it forces these themes with its storytelling. And ultimately, what is this game about, beyond connection? So let's start by getting my basic narrative thoughts out of the way. For most people, the hardest part to swallow of Death Stranding was the gameplay. But for me, it was the story, or one half of it. See, we've already established that Death Stranding is a story about connection, first and foremost. But behind that, there's also an existential sci-fi plotline that runs on throughout the entire game. If I'm honest, this is actually the larger half of a narrative. So much time is spent fleshing out all of these elements, like BTs, the beach, the Death Stranding itself, Chiralium, and so on and so forth. But the problem is that these narratives do not complement each other. In fact, the sci-fi stuff really just complicates the premise that was already outlined. You know what? I'm actually just going to let Video Game Donkey take over for a second, because he summarizes my thoughts on this pretty well.
When we start the game as Sam Bridges, he is very cynical and distant. He doesn't trust anyone. He doesn't want to be a part of anyone's life. The only music he listens to is Radiohead. He literally has a medical condition where his skin bruises up if someone touches him. He lives a very isolated, sad life that I think a lot of people can relate to, especially now. But then he goes on a journey to connect the entire United States up to the internet, and as he's traveling across the country and delivering Cheetos to all of these people, he starts making connections. He starts making friends that begin to restore his faith in humanity. That is all the story Death Stranding needed. You walk out into a desolate landscape and slowly bring it back to life.
Honestly, this video is pretty much why I'm not talking about the story all that much, because it summarizes most of my thoughts on it. Sure, all the stuff about the beach and life and death and whatever is entertaining, but it's ultimately empty. But when you spend the better part of 11 hours of cutscenes explaining and fleshing out things like BTs or the Death Stranding, do you really want the audience to just be entertained? If the game was just about Sam, it'd be so much better, because Sam Porter Bridges is the best part about this game's story, and I mean that. Sam is not a silent protagonist, but I feel like he's the perfect audience stand-in. You'll get 30 minutes of lore drop straight, and for 90% of that conversation, Sam will just be standing there looking like he lost track of the conversation 5 minutes in. One of my favorite moments in the game is when a character tries to sit down and have a conversation with him, and he legitimately falls asleep 5 seconds in. He's had a long day, okay? Sam feels like the straight man to all of the nonsense that is Death Stranding. I don't know if it's by design, but experiencing this acid trip of a narrative through his lens is almost comedic at times. And personally speaking, this is what kept Death Stranding entertaining the whole time. It's the juxtaposition of all these characters who are deeply involved with Bridges or for Death Stranding, and you have Sam, who didn't really even want to be here in the first place, but got guilted into it because his mom slash sister slash whatever Anomaly is in this game had asked him to be here. Now, that's not to say Sam doesn't have his own story here. Dunkey already kindly outlined what Sam's story was for us earlier, and it's the best part of the game. But to ultimately talk about Sam's story, we have to talk about that ending. Spoilers, I guess. If you're still here, I feel like you don't care, but the ending of Death Stranding could very well be the most notorious part of the game. Why? Because it just doesn't stop. Seriously, man, I had heard that it was rough going into it, but I did not know how bad it really was. According to my Steam achievements, I sat down probably around 2:30 to beat the game. I did not beat it until 11:49 a.m. the next day. Okay, that's a joke. I mean, it's true, but I threw in a towel the previous night at 10 p.m. to go to bed, and then the following morning I beat it. And I took breaks and such, so it wasn't all just straight gameplay, but even so, that's at least 5 hours of the game playing itself out, which is crazy. But can I be totally honest with you? I actually kind of like the ending. I end up thinking back on it quite fondly. Mostly because of the absurdity of it all. The constant surprise of the fact that we're still doing this, we're still here, we're still going. At the start of Chapter 10, you are told that you have to walk your butt all the way back to Capital Knot City from Edge Knot City. If you don't know what that means, then let me tell you, it's the entire map. The last 40 hours of the game, you've been making your way across America to the West Coast, and then you hightail it all the way back. When they first gave me this directive, I was in disbelief, honestly. But surprisingly, it's a lot easier than it sounds. Firstly, the map feels a lot bigger when you travel it the first time because you're making a lot of stops and going off a lot of beaten paths. In this case, it's point A to B with no stops. It only took me like an hour to actually do, and I was pleasantly surprised with how much I enjoyed it. Firstly, it's just satisfying to walk through all these places you've been again, for this one last time bringing things full circle. It also shows just how much you've improved by how well you can navigate these places compared to when you first arrived. I also couldn't help but love that when you leave Edge Knot City, the Low Roar song Please Don't Stop Chapter 1 plays, and when you arrive at Capital Knot City, Please Don't Stop Chapter 2 plays. And those are some of my favorite songs by Low Roar, and the usage was great. But even then, the game still isn't done, and that gets to the real problem with the ending. You could say that it's too long, and that would be true, but I think there's a much easier way to fix the ending than by cutting all this stuff out. As I mentioned earlier, I sat down to beat the game when I thought it was about to end. That was in Chapter 9. There are 14 chapters in this game. The problem isn't merely that the ending is too long, the ending of the game is poorly telegraphed. The ending of Chapter 9 is framed as the end of the game. That's what the game was essentially communicating to you. You're about to reach your final destination and all the plot pieces are coming together, and they pull the whole "this is your final mission, make sure you're ready before you go." Something that's important to note is that most people that have made it this far into Death Stranding, this 40 plus hours in, are probably pretty committed to this game. And if I can speak for myself, and I think for many others as well, when you sit down to beat a game that you are this invested in, you're probably going to be pretty set on beating that game when you sit down to actually beat it. What if, instead of pulling the final mission warning crap 5 hours before the game actually ended, what if they did it before the game actually ends? Then I wouldn't have felt obligated to continue going all of this in one sitting. I already mentioned this, but you progress 5 chapters during this ending span of the game. There are plenty of points when you could stop in there, but who really wants to stop when they think the end is right around the corner? I would think nobody, except for me when the end actually is right around the corner, but whatever. If players didn't feel like they were committed to beating the game at that moment, then I'm sure plenty of people would have just put down the controller and treated it like any other play session, just playing until they were done. But like I already said, the poor telegraphing on when the ending actually is makes a lot of people get invested in beating the game before they're actually close to doing so. All of the conversation about the Death Stranding finale usually centers around the length, but the other areas of discussion would be the resolution to Sam's story. As we've already established, Sam's character arc in Death Stranding is learning to open up and connect with others after a family tragedy causes him to closet himself in. Well, at the end of the game, he kind of flips on that. It comes out of nowhere as well. It's hard to make a commentary on this narrative choice when the sequel is so close, and we might get more elaboration on this in that game. But I'm still not sure why they chose to go this route with Sam. I have two thoughts on why this could be. Sam says, "Everything I touch, I lose," in the end of the game. I wonder if this is Sam acknowledging that he cares for people now, but is too scared of losing them to actually make them part of his life. This could be interesting to explore, but the game ends in like 30 minutes, so that's not happening. My other thought on why this could be, we'll have to wait until the interpretation side of things. So after that interaction, Sam leaves to take Lou to the incinerator, and leaving out a lot of drama, the game ends with him living alone and taking care of Lou as his kid. It's hard because I really like the idea of Sam going to live a peaceful life and raise his son, but I don't like him rejecting everything that he learned to appreciate right before this happens. It creates a narrative whiplash that left me conflicted in a way that probably wasn't desired. In a way, it reflects the story on paper as a whole. Some strong standout moments, but those moments don't get to properly breathe without getting crowded out by a dozen other questionable things. Wow, Kojima really is a genius. I will always persist that storytelling is just as important as the story being told. Similarly to the rest of the game, the storytelling in Death Stranding is not simply good or bad. It's outstanding and it's terrible, both at the same time. You see, Death Stranding has the opposite issue of most games. In a majority of AAA titles, there's a divide between narrative and gameplay. Usually, the gameplay and the story function apart from each other, and gameplay doesn't really reinforce the themes of the game. That burden is left entirely to cutscenes and dialogue. The funny thing about Death Stranding is that it actually explores its themes quite well through gameplay, and really not well through its cutscenes. Let's dig into that, starting on the gameplay side. You should know by now that Death Stranding is a game about connection, and the visual representation of connection in Death Stranding is the rope. The place where you feel the rope the strongest is when you're actually playing the game. I discussed this a lot already in the gameplay segment, but few other games manage to mend the gap of the story and gameplay so seamlessly, and the way the theme is explored is so cool. Of course, we have the initial fact that you're a delivery man connecting people to the chiral network. You are literally connecting people to each other in the primary gameplay loop. And then there's the social strand network, which allows you to connect with other real players as you progress the game, which I've already said is the best part of the game, hands down. More games need to try to be like Death Stranding in this regard. Not by being a packaged delivery game, but by being intentional with how you express your narrative elements through gameplay. Whenever a game does that well, that is what makes it truly special in my eyes. Each and every artistic medium has a different way of telling stories. Books, movies, music, and paintings, all of those things have different strategies for speaking to the audience that specifically utilize the medium they're in. The same thing applies to video games, but in the larger picture, most of the storytelling ideas video games use are pretty much taken over from movies primarily. And for some things, that's fine. Like, show don't tell, that's a good rule that applies to writing in general, and it's applicable across mediums. But video games these days borrow so much from film that most video game stories these days might be better as movies. Of course, there are exceptions to this. But people need to understand that you can tell a story through gameplay just as well as you can through cutscenes and dialogue. Death Stranding hits that nail right in the head, and it makes the act of merely playing the game an extension of its narrative. I think that's amazing. Genuinely, I just think about this sometimes. And it's so funny that this comes from Mr. Hideo My Game Should Be Movies Kojima. And to make it even funnier, the storytelling outside gameplay sucks. The storytelling in Death Stranding's cutscenes and dialogue confuses me. Firstly, because they got it so right in the gameplay, and so wrong here. But also because of the context. If we zoom out and look at Kojima's most recent game before Death Stranding, Metal Gear Solid V, we get a very different picture of storytelling from Kojima. MGS-V is a distinct departure from Kojima's usual style when it comes to storytelling. The whole game fascinates me, but it's that deviation that really gets me thinking. Metal Gear as a series up to that point did not care much for subtlety. Kojima was very much happy to explain exactly what he wanted you to think after any given moment, and the series as a whole has a reputation of talking your ear off. But in MGS-V, we have a drastic shift in Kojima's style, and suddenly he's taking a much more reined in and almost subtle approach to storytelling. It's a much more conservative experience. Gone are the days of 50 to 50 game to cutscene ratio and extremely blatant exposition. Well, mostly gone. Man, the Jeep ride could have been run-of-the-mill in a different MGS game, but it comes out of nowhere in V and it's so funny. Anyways, when I think of the changes Kojima took in MGS V, I think of a few moments, but for the sake of not spoiling the main twist of the game, I'm just going to talk about this one. I think about the episode where Paz returns. Paz is a character who died earlier in MGS-V, but now she's inexplicably returned out of nowhere. But she doesn't really remember who she actually is. She has some serious psyche issues like DID that are causing her to be trapped in a static mindset. When you get to the end of this quote-unquote questline, it turns out that Paz wasn't actually real. She was still dead, and it was a hallucination by Big Boss the whole time. But then this moment just kind of ends. There's no takeaway or message. Nobody stops you to talk about what that hallucination meant or anything. This questline is completely isolated from the rest of the story too. In fact, it's optional. You don't even have to play it. Initially, you'll wonder what was even the point of that. But after I researched it more, I found the discussion about what that scene really was, and I was thoroughly shocked. I won't get into the multiple interpretations of what that scene meant because I don't want to spoil it too much more, and I'll probably do an MGS-V video one day anyways, but it was just such a cool thing to discover. I mean, think about that. Even the idea of having interpretations in a Kojima game. That's crazy. So to pivot from MGS-V, a game that is very much comfortable to just let you figure it out as it stays mostly quiet, into Death Stranding, which goes back into wanting to feed all the information directly into your skull slowly and specifically, is honestly disappointing. So much of the cutscenes in this game is just people explaining things to Sam in the most straightforward way. Something else that MGS-V largely did away with was mandatory codec calls that interrupt gameplay. Well, guess what? They're back. Though they don't stretch as long as the old codec calls would, they are usually redundant and much more boring in presentation. Also, in Metal Gear Solid V, the cutscenes saw an upgrade in style, and that upgrade is only occasionally seen in Death Stranding. In MGS-V, all the cutscenes are captured in a way that makes it feel like it's being filmed by a camera crew that was set to follow around Big Boss and get footage for like a documentary or something. This style is consistent throughout the majority of the game, and even in conversations when the camera is being more still, the characters themselves are doing more interesting things, talking about more interesting things, or at least talking in a way that is entertaining. In Death Stranding, there's a distinct lack of cinematography style. Certain scenes are notable, or do something fun with the visuals or camera, but largely the cinematography feels mostly function over flavor. I mean, it's still probably better than a lot of other games out there, but I can't help be disappointed by it. It especially hurts in these moments of exposition, because that's when I really need at least something to be entertaining, but it's mostly just static shots with frequent cuts that really just serve to get the job done. It doesn't help that most of the time, characters aren't doing interesting things or talking in an entertaining way in these scenarios. I would guess that the stillness of the camera in this game is so that you can focus on the digital recreations of the Hollywood actors in this game, since that's something Death Stranding pioneered. There's lots of close-ups on faces in this game, especially the ones played by celebrities. I think this could have worked better when the technology was better, but in this game, the digital models lack the nuance in performance and expression that an actual human face does. And that will always be the case, but Death Stranding 2 seems to be mending that gap quite a bit. Another problem Death Stranding has is how it answers questions. The first 10 hours of Death Stranding set up a lot of narrative questions, and unfortunately, a lot of those questions get paid off suddenly and unceremoniously, both through exposition and cutscene, but also emails and data logs, also known as the nail in the coffin. These are pretty self-explanatory, I would think. As you connect more people to the chiral network, you'll gain access to data that was lost, and people that you've connected with can send you emails. As if the cutscenes weren't enough, this is where you get your extra helping of exposition. So many of the interesting questions I had about the world were randomly answered through these things. This, honestly, caused me to be less engaged with the narrative than more engaged. I guess it was kind of demotivating. I was genuinely interested in some of these topics, and for them to just be kind of pushed aside and answered in the most uninteresting way made me feel like I wasn't going to be rewarded for engaging in the world any more than the base narrative required. But the moment that really set me against the data log specifically was a moment in the story when they referenced Kaz and Haas. I do not feel like explaining Kaz and Haz to you, but essentially, it's the ancient Egyptian distinction between body and soul. This concept is talked about in one of the data logs early-ish in the game, and that's fine and cool, whatever. But I immediately became jaded against it on this scene.
Her Ka passed over to the other side, but her Ha remained, bound to our dead daughter. She knew all of this, of course.
Like, okay, having the data logs as complementary information was fine. I didn't really like how it was handled, but it wasn't intrusive. But at this moment, they expect you to have read those data logs to understand what the heck she was talking about. And I thought, no way. There's no chance you're telling me that all of this stuff is required reading. Seriously, look at how much of it there is. And in hindsight, it wasn't as big of a deal as I thought it was then, but it's still very dumb. A way to make these data logs less tedious would be to take another cue from MGSV and let you play these audio tapes while traversing the world. But that isn't something you can do. So if the only option you have is to read them inside of your private room, which isn't that entertaining, and I like reading. Sidetracking for a moment, I've been playing this game called Pacific Drive recently. Completely different type of game, but similar in that there are a lot of entry logs and the like to read. The thing about the logs in Pacific Drive, though, is that they're written by real people in the game. They actually sound like people transcribing their thoughts to the paper. There's emotion and changes in perspective. This variety makes the log entries in Pacific Drive more interesting and engaging to read. Death Stranding's data logs read like Wikipedia articles, impersonal and flavorless. It's just a cycle of information intake, and eventually I just got overloaded and stopped reading. And that's the dichotomy of Death Stranding's storytelling. On one side, it's teaching the game industry how it needs to do better, and on the other, it stumbles worse than most games in its place. It's this dual state of existence that makes Death Stranding such a conundrum to me, and it's why I'm here right now making this video. And to finally wrap things up, I want to talk about my interpretation of Death Stranding. Alright, we're finally at our last stop, interpretation. What is Death Stranding really about? Well, I don't have to ask that question, because it's about connection. I've said it a million times now, take a shot every time I say that. But through all of my digging for this video, I think I have another interpretation to go alongside the main theme. Full disclosure, I haven't really looked into what the wider world interprets Death Stranding as, so I might be beating a dead horse here. But hey, you made it this far, so you care at least a little bit to hear what I have to say. Kojima has been notorious for letting you know that he worked on the game you're playing. There's nothing wrong with this, it's just very on brand for him. And since Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, he has started putting the text, a Hideo Kojima game, on the box art for his titles. And keeping up the trend in Death Stranding, you'll see on the box art the text reading, a Hideo Kojima game. But in this case, I think it's literal, because Death Stranding is a game about Hideo Kojima. Kojima traces some of the game's themes back to the abject depression he felt as a latchkey kid. I felt lonely when I was talking to my friends because they couldn't understand. I wanted to go home and turn on the lights because I was frightened. I had so many friends at school, but I was lonely. I didn't tell anyone. I thought I was sick. He became the class comedian as a cover, but even as a popular student, felt isolated. Then he discovered Taxi Driver. Travis Bickle was the same as me in a way. I'm Japanese. I thought every American guy never even felt solitude, but this was new to me. When I saw Taxi Driver, I was surprised, but I empathized. I felt relieved. Kojima wanted to relay that feeling to players. That's why I added this indirect online connection in the game, so that people will feel it's alright, it's okay. You're relieved that you're not alone. You see other people's footprints and think it's not just me here. All art contains a piece of the artist. Whether it's a child's drawings or Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver, each of those pieces contains some fragment of the artist's individuality. So when I say that Death Stranding is a game that Kojima poured himself into, don't simply think that I mean it contains his directorial attributes. It is my belief that Death Stranding is Kojima's fantastical, sometimes unhinged way of putting you in his own shoes. The more I read about this game, the more I believe that. Death Stranding was Kojima's first game at his own independent studio. Prior to this, Kojima had worked with Konami to publish all the Metal Gear Solid games. And from a creative sense, the Metal Gear series is Kojima sharing his worldview with you, his perspective, his thoughts. But without Konami to answer to, I believe he pivoted to a game that wasn't so much as his worldview, and more so his life and his experiences. Death Stranding is Kojima wanting to give you a piece of his life and his mind to you. In a way, I see Death Stranding as Kojima's way of forming connection with his audience. Let's look at another excerpt.
学生の時にちょっとだけ年末に郵便配達のバイトしたことあるんですよね。バイクで行くんですけど、ちょっと山奥の地域を任されまして、でそこで当時はネットがなかったので、やっぱり今とは違うんですよ。年賀状の重みというのが、年に1回それで家族の安否を知るみたいなあるじゃないですか。写真つけて。なんで僕は任されてバイトなんですけども、絶対届けないといけない。で届けに行くと待ってる人がいて、途中に野良犬がいたり大変なことが雪が降ってきて坂でこけたりとかバイクをこけたりとかありましたけど、あの時の経験は結構ゲームの元になってたり、くれてる人がいるっていうのがこの暗黙の了解で行かないといけないじゃないですか。で届けた時のその感謝されることとか、その達成感っていうのがあって、でその辺はなかなか。
And this is another way that Death Stranding is putting you in Kojima's shoes. I'm not sure I would call Death Stranding a biography, but let's be real, if anyone was going to do a biography like this, it would be Kojima.
Or Robbie Williams, apparently.
But Death Stranding is also a game that is for Kojima. A pivotal event in young Hideo's life was the passing of his father when Hideo was only 13 years old. The impact that event had on him is apparent just by looking at his games. Each of his games has a father character involved. I mean, look at Big Boss. He's the catalyst character of the series, and ultimately he is best known as the father of Solid Snake. And spoilers, the Metal Gear Solid series ends with Snake finally making peace with his father. And in this vein, it's why I still kind of like Death Stranding's ending. Because even though it's contrary to everything that came before it, it's ultimately a father running away from everything to spend some time with his son. To me, it's beautiful, because I think that's really what Kojima dreams of himself for his own childhood. Something else that impacted Kojima was the passing of his mother during the production of Death Stranding. His father died when Kojima was 13, leaving his mother with the burden of raising her son as a single parent. He developed such a feeling of protectiveness towards her that when he launched his independent studio post-Konami and began developing Death Stranding, Kojima kept it a secret from her. I thought, I'll tell her once I've become a little more successful, he says. I didn't want her to worry, but she died during the game's gestation. The ghosts in the game, maybe my parents are one of them, seeing me in this world. He adds, I wanted to have that kind of metaphor, that within you, you're connected to the people that passed away. Kojima admits to regrets about not telling his mother about the game. He appears shaken as he says it. BTs are an interpretation of a feeling Kojima already has in his real life. I believe BTs are almost a comfort to Kojima, and I think he put them in the game as a way of connecting with his parents again, as a way of consoling himself. But he wants you to be able to share that experience with him. I tried for a little while to tie the super complex sci-fi elements into this interpretation, and I was really trying to figure out how to make these fit into the picture, but I realized something. In all of these interviews, when Kojima talks about the story or narrative, he really just says he wants to connect people. He doesn't talk much about the political or societal commentary he may or may not be giving with his other story elements. And that's when I came to the conclusion that in the end, that stuff is not important. I suppose if I was trying to figure out what the sci-fi elements represented, it would probably be how Kojima's imagination has always been taking normal things and creating something wild out of them. But I don't really have any references to that statement, that's just the way I feel about it. One way I see Death Stranding is like this. You know that cliche where someone is painting and they just close their eyes and quote-unquote paint what they feel? That's what I see Death Stranding as. It's an expression of Kojima's life and mine as a vessel for him to share that with you. And so if you ask me what I think Death Stranding is about, I think the easiest way to sum it up is this. Death Stranding is a Hideo Kojima game. Wow, that's it. Yeah, that's the video. I didn't script this outro. I'm just kind of going with it. Thanks for watching all the way through to the end. This was fun to make. I've been thinking a lot about this game since I played it, and it took a while to write all this out. And I mean, I feel like I could still tweak some things and talk about some things. Like, I was gonna have a whole discussion about like the visual storytelling and the things like the strands. How the strand is your main weapon of the game, but it's a rope. And then it's also your weapon, and like, what does that mean, and all that, and like the handcuffs that you use for bridges, the cufflinks, and how they're handcuffs that connect you to bridges. So it's like a connection, but it's also symbolizing a chain. Whatever. I was going to do talking about that. I was going to talk about that, but I decided not to because this is just getting too long, and I kind of forgot. But really, thanks so much for watching up to this point. Let me know in the comments what you think. I feel like this is the longest video essay I've made so far, so I'm very open to hearing things, hearing criticism or constructive criticism and the likes. But let's see, any other words to say? Leave a like, subscribe, comment on this video. You know, get a small YouTuber like me to get more subscribers or something. I don't know. Whatever, man. Flipping stuff. Yeah, but I'm curious to know, let me know in the comments what your interpretation of Death Stranding is, because I don't know if mine's conventional or not. Like I said, I still haven't researched what other people say about this game. Yeah. And if I got anything wrong, let me know in the comments. But hey, thanks for watching. Okay, since you watched all the way to the black screen, you get to hear me talk about the naming conventions of this game. Oh my gosh, the naming conventions. This is an unscripted rant, by the way. The naming conventions in this game kind of drive me insane, but I kind of love them at the same time. I mean, like, so, first off, Sam, the main character, Sam Porter Bridges. Sam is a porter that works for the company Bridges, and his last name is Porter Bridges. Though that's not his real last name. His last name is actually Strand. But I don't think that makes it any better. Sam Strand. Sam Strand is the guy that connects the country together, making strands. Yeah. Good job, Kojima. I don't even want to look into like the hidden meaning of the word Sam or something like that, because I'm scared. And then Fragile. Guess what Fragile does? Yeah, she's a package delivery person. I wonder why they named her Fragile. Blah blah. And then, oh, you know what? Flippin' Die Hard Man, because he just doesn't die. Like Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker. That game had a character named Hot Coldman. And when I first found out about that, I was like, that's kind of a stupid name. I wonder why he named him that. That's kind of dumb. And then I realized, as I looked at Death Stranding, that Peace Walker was just the tip of the iceberg of Kojima naming conventions. Because he's off the wall in this game. Like Hartman. I love Hartman. He's like my Hartman is my favorite Death Stranding character that is not Sam. But oh my gosh. Guess what? If you were to guess one thing about Hartman based on his name, guess what it is? If you guessed he has heart problems, you'd be correct. Hartman has heart problems. Oh, and you know what else? His heart is literally heart-shaped. They go out of their way to show you that in the game. His heart is like a comical beating heart inside of his chest. It is I don't even know how I feel about it. And then outside of his lab, there's just a heart lake, inexplicably. There's a lake that is in the shape of a heart, and so it's like, awesome. Thanks. Like, okay, cool, Kojima. Let's see. Mama? Guess one thing about that character. Guess one thing about the character Mama. If you guess that she has a kid, yeah, you'd be right. Wow, crazy. Crazy stuff, man. Let me think. Dead Man. Can you guess what Dead Man's bit is? I mean, if you said he's dead, that's kind of right. It's actually that he's made up from dead people, which is, I mean, like, close enough, honestly, for me. Like, seriously. And I mean, it's just mind-boggling. I heard someone say that Kojima hates naming characters, and like, maybe that's it. Or maybe he just goes with the whatever the studio starts calling these characters. Like, during production, he doesn't name the characters, and then he just lets the people designing them name them. And like all the game designers like, hey, how's the model coming along for that the Die Hard Man guy? And they're like, okay, that's his name. We're calling him Die Hard Man. Kojima, send it. I have no clue. I don't even know, man. How did this... I just don't understand. Kojima, what are you doing? I'm going now.